Hey guys, what is up and welcome to a new League of Legends video. So I've made a couple of videos already talking about professional player builds, one for Zed and one for Azir. And this is something I want to start doing more frequently, and to start things off once again I thought, you know what, let's make a video talking about how Faker and Bjergsen, two of the best mid laners in League of Legends, play Taliyah. Taliyah has been definitely rising in popularity. People are starting to slowly realize that she is indeed a very strong champion. But it'll be even more interesting to see how the best of the best actually build her, what exactly they do and what kind of scenario and all that good stuff. So right before we actually jump into the topic, the question of today's video is, who would win in a 1v1, Bjergsen or Faker? And if you end up enjoying this video and want more like it, then let me know by hitting the like button. So throughout this video, like I said, we'll be going through Faker's and Bjergsen's build on Taliyah, their runes, their masteries, their build, and there's different types of builds in different scenarios, their skill order, the different summoner spells they use and when, and all that good stuff. So let's first start things off by talking about what runes do Bjergsen and Faker both use on Taliyah. Now for the most part, the rune pages are very similar. I mean, they both have magic penetration reds, they both have flat AP quints, and they both have HP per level yellows. It's the blues that make the difference. For instance, in the page on the very top left, he uses that usually against low poke champions because he's able to put extra CDR into those blues. But if he's facing someone in the mid lane that has a lot of trade potential in the laning phase, so maybe LeBlanc, maybe someone even like Fizz or someone like Victor, then you want to go for the page at the bottom right because that has flat magic resistance blues, and that'll help you in the laning phase so that you don't die and you don't end up feeding. For the most part, it's pretty standard stuff when it comes to just mid lane AP champions in general, but let's take a look at what Faker does. For the most part, and especially recently, Faker seems to just run one rune page in general whenever he's playing Taliyah. Magic penetration reds, HP per level yellows, and flat AP quins, but his blues end up being enough for 10% at level 18 for cooldown reduction, and the other 3 blues are simply AP per level. But let's take a quick look at Faker's mastery page to see what he does. So both players do go for 12-18-0, but there are slight differences. So for instance, you can see Faker ends up getting rune affinity, because he seems to enjoy having those blue buffs for just a little bit longer, and in the ferocity tree he ends up getting the spell vamp rather than the AP per level and the AD per level. But taking a very quick look at Bjergsen's mastery page, again it is 12-18-0 as well, they both go Thunderlords, but he prefers getting the biscuits instead of the runic affinity, and he also ends up going for the AP per level and the AD per level rather than the spell vamp. But other than that, the rune pages are extremely similar, they don't really make the biggest of differences, and it just comes down to personal preference. But now that we got the runes and the masteries out of the way, let's next move into the items and just what is the overall build that these players use on Taliyah. So I did my very best to make this graphic on the right seem as readable as possible, but I will be going through it with you right now. So both players always start with the Doran's ring and potions, obviously Bjergsen getting the biscuits while Faker having the regular potions because of their masteries. But let's take a look at Bjergsen's build first because it is a little bit more simple since his build tends to be very consistent. Now in a lot of his games, Bjergsen does seem to enjoy getting the double Doran, so the one he starts off initially with plus 1 more on his first back. Following that, he also likes to get a very early Negatron, which he eventually later on builds into an Abyssal Scepter, but then he finishes it up with the Morellonomicon, gets his boots of choice, which just depends on what he's facing. So if the enemy team has a lot of annoying slows, then he'll go for the boots of swiftness. If they don't, and he feels a little more comfortable or safe, he'll go for the sword. But either way, for Bjergsen, the absolute core items without question seem to be your Morellonomicon, your Abyssal, and your Rylai's, and your Void Staff. Then you can either go for Rabadons if you're feeling safe and you want to continue the snowball and deal a lot of damage, or you can go for the Zhonya's Hourglass if the enemy team has a lot of dive and you just feel like you have to play a little bit safer. But moving over to Faker's build, now he has 3 different build paths that he tends to do just depending on what he's facing. But keep in mind, for all 3 of these Faker builds, he almost always gets items such as Rabadons or Void Staff or even a Zhonya's, just depends again on the scenario, very similar to Bjergsen. The main difference lies in which items he gets for his first 3 or so items and in what order. So let's go over that right now. Now the first item path that Faker seems to do is as follows. Rod of Ages into a Negatron, into a Rylai's Crystal Scepter, and into an Abyssal Scepter. This is the build path that Faker seems to do whenever he faces a lot of champions that have heavy burst damage, because the HP from the Rod of Ages and the Rylai's and even the magic resistance from the Abyssal makes him fairly tanky, still does a lot of damage, but mainly to be able to survive survive any just crazy burst damage. Also, I'm sure most of you are wondering, why do I have the refillable potion listed at the beginning of all 3 builds? Well, that tends to be the case with Faker if he's facing a champion in mid lane that has a lot of poke. But if the person he's facing mid lane doesn't have a lot of poke or isn't really a huge threat to Faker in the laning phase, then he simply just does not get the refillable potion, maybe gets 1 or 2 regular potions after the first back, and that's about it. But looking at Faker's number 2 build, this is the one he usually takes against skill shots because he ends up skipping the Abyssal Scepter. He simply relies on his own mechanical skill to dodge the skill shots. And the overall build can look something like this: Morellonomicon into our Rallies, into a Void Staff, and into a Rabadons. But moving on to build number 3, this is one he gets whenever he's facing tanky champions, but he also has a fairly beefy frontline on his own team since he does get that Liandry's Torment. But for the most part, you guys can probably see that Rallies Crystal Scepter tends to be an extremely core item among both players, and Morellonomicon tends to be very popular as well. Now, the one thing missing from all 3 of Faker's builds are obviously the boots. Now, whichever boots he chooses tends to be very flexible based on whatever he's facing. So, for instance, in the first build, if he's able to go for it, he'll go for Lucidity boots since he is kind of lacking a bit of CDR. If the enemy team has a ridiculous amount of CC, he tends to enjoy the Merc boots. If he feels comfortable, he'll go for the Sork boots. If they have a lot of slows, he'll go for the boots of swiftness. It really just depends on what he's facing and which build he's also doing. But all in all, that should be clear enough to give you guys a pretty decent idea on what kind of builds these 2 pro players end up doing on Taliyah, when and why. But there's still 2 more things we have to quickly touch on, and the first of which is the skill order. Now, for obvious reasons, both players always start with their Q first, unless of course they can make some crazy level 1 catch with a big team fight happening somewhere in the jungle, maybe with their W or E. But for the most part, even then, your Q is still probably your best choice. But here's where it differs very slightly. Now, Bjergsen tends to almost always level his E ability at level 2 for the wave clear and just to push in and be overall a very dominant force in the laning phase. Faker, on the other hand, gets his W at level 2 if he feels like his jungler will be doing an early gank, maybe after red buff. But if his jungler tends to be someone who's very passive or someone who's just focused on farming or not ganking his lane, he'll get his E at level 2 instead. But either way, both players end up maxing their R of course whenever they can, followed by their Q, followed by their E, and then their W. And the final thing to mention before we end off this video is the summoner spells. Now, both of these players tend to rotate between taking Flash with either Ghost, Ignite, Teleport, Cleanse, or Exhaust. Now, Faker, whenever you're looking at his matches and his statistics, he seems to really enjoy taking Flash and Ghost, especially recently. While Bjergsen, on the other hand, seems to be a lot more flexible with his summoners, but a general way to look at it is as follows. You want to take Ghost versus mobile champions, Exhaust versus heavy damage burst or assassinate type champions, Teleport during farm lanes, and Ignite versus low range enemies for extra kill pressure and to try and snowball your lane, though Ignite, for the most part in my honest opinion, is probably the weakest summoner of the rest of them. But there you guys have it, Faker's and Bjergsen's Taliyah build, what exactly they do, the overall items, runes, masteries, skill order, and even the summoners. She is honestly a very strong champion, but she does have a high skill cap and people are slowly starting to understand her and also realize her power. So if you're ever trying to go in and play a game with Taliyah and maybe in a ranked game or a normal and you're not really sure maybe what to build, or you want to have a better idea, or you want to see what the best of the best do on her, hopefully this video helps you out in that regard. So if you guys did enjoy this video, then let me know by hitting that like button, especially if you want to see more like it for other professional players and other champions. Make sure to share this with your friends, as I'm sure a lot of people are probably curious to see what exactly are the best of the best doing with Taliyah, especially now that her popularity is slowly increasing. But I thank each and every one of you so much for watching, and I hope to see you for the next video. Peace.